No hay duda que esas declaraciones de Ford responden al hecho de que los imperialistas están irritados con nosotros. ¿Y por qué están irritados? Porque lo tenían todo planeado.
United States, Cuba, two nations separated by less than 150 kilometers, but with ideologies that could not be more distant. The ties between the Soviet Union and the island country, which was increasingly turning towards communism, were strengthened with each passing day. This caused the Americans to consider Fidel Castro's government as one of the greatest threats in the entire continent. Their values, which had made them one of the most powerful nations in the world, were under threat. Thus, many of the American military leaders began to express their desire to invade Cuba and depose its leader.
The nations of this hemisphere should fail to meet their commitments against outside communist penetration, then I want it clearly understood that this government will not hesitate in meeting its primary obligations, which are to the security of our nation.
But first, they had to come up with an argument to justify the attack. Numerous plans were considered, from shooting down an American plane and blaming the Cuban government, to state terrorism against American citizens themselves. Nothing seemed too much. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the so-called Operation Northwoods. Join us to see what the plan was like with which the United States intended to justify its invasion of Cuba. The strategies that sought to give the United States an excuse to attack Cuba were encompassed in what was called Operation Northwoods. This was planned in 1962, at the height of the Cold War, and proposed by some members of the U.S. Department of Defense, together with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In addition, it had the support of certain sectors of the CIA. Those in charge of the project gave a series of ideas that seem imagined by those fanatics of conspiracy theories, but they were all completely real. The first of these plans consisted of making Cuba believe that a U.S. invasion was imminent. Uncle Sam's ships would become visible in the Caribbean Gulf, while thousands of soldiers would be moved towards the eastern coasts of the North American nation. Rumors of a massive arms deployment would be broadcast on the radios of the small island. And Guantanamo Bay, in Cuban territory but under U.S. hands, would be put on alert. All these maneuvers may sound counterproductive if the Yankees' intention was to invade, but their objective was different. Their desire was that Fidel Castro, imagining an imminent attack against his nation, would attack first. This would give Uncle Sam the perfect excuse to carry out an offensive of his own. In this way, claiming their innocence, they could carry out the conquest of Cuba and the deposition of the current government. This was the most traditional idea of Operation Northwoods, and one that they had already carried out successfully in previous wars. But from here, the strategies took a sharp turn. If the first plan did not work, the second consisted of carrying out a series of coldly calculated incidents in the surroundings of the American naval base in Guantanamo Bay. Among them, they listed dressing Cubans, sympathetic to the Washington government as saboteurs, and capturing them, claiming that they were seeking to damage the facilities. But they would even resort to carrying out these acts, destroying ammunition boxes and even airplanes inside the base. The attacks would not have resulted in fatalities, but that would not be the version circulated by the media. to turn public opinion against Castro and in favor of the invasion. The deaths of American soldiers would be mourned, and even fake funerals would be held. There was also a plan to blow up a ship stationed in Guantanamo Bay, blaming the Cuban forces. A deception that the Americans had already carried out in the past.
This was specifically called out as a, quote, remember the Maine incident, referencing the sinking of an American warship in Cuba in the late 1800s that the US used to justify intervening in Cuba back then to fight the Spanish. This is often thought of as a planned sabotage to justify the intervention. And here was the US military in the 60s at it again.
The ship that would be destroyed to incite the invasion of Cuba would not be manned, so there would be no fatalities. However, starting with the fourth point proposed by Operation Northwoods, the plan began to take a macabre turn. After Fidel Castro took over the Cuban government in 1959, the United States began to receive a large number of refugees fleeing the island for fear of reprisals by the revolutionaries. Years later, boats full of people continued to arrive, making this dangerous journey through the waters that separated both countries. Using the Cuban refugees as a scapegoat, the Department of Defense planned an offensive with them as protagonists. This time, the fatalities would be real.
They also wanted to create a fake terrorist campaign on American soil in Miami or Washington. They wanted to sink boats of Cuban refugees and stage the shooting of refugee targets, and even suggested exploding a few plastic bombs in American cities. These weren't all going to be pretend. They even say in the document that they would go to the extent of wounding people and then making fake arrests with prepared documents so it could all be widely publicized.
Another of the stipulated points was to make the American population believe that Cuba was interfering in the governments of other countries. Unlike the other plans, this one had a grain of truth. Castro and his officials had witnessed attempts at revolutions in nations such as Panama and the Dominican Republic, for example. But the American strategy went further. Some of the ideas considered were using Cuban airplane models or painting their own to resemble them, and using them to fly over the airspace of countries neighboring the island. Burning and destroying crop fields in the countries with weapons belonging to the Soviet Union, Castro's political ally. Finally, false radio messages to communist organizations in these nations would be intercepted by the American intelligence services. The objective was to make the governments most aligned with the American vision believe that Cuba was preparing to spread its influence over them. In this way, an invasion would be seen as a way to protect them from the clutches of the Kremlin and its ideas. In addition, the airplanes painted as enemy fighter planes would also have another objective. They would be used to harass U.S. civilian aircraft by flying around them. They would not open fire on the vehicle, but would seek to intimidate the passengers into believing they were under threat. The pilot of the commercial flight would be aware of the maneuver and would inform those on board that the hostile aircraft belonged to the Cuban government or its Soviet allies. The memo detailed the plan in a series of numerous steps.
To start with, an aircraft would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate for an actual registered civilian aircraft, which would belong to a CIA shell company in Miami. This duplicate would be swapped for the actual aircraft at some point, with the actual aircraft being converted into a drone. A complicated maneuver would then be pulled off, with both aircraft being sent up, the actual plane being sent back down and reverted to its original status, and the drone continuing over Cuba. The drone would then send a mayday signal that it was under attack by a Cuban aircraft, aircraft, and then a bomb would be remotely detonated via radio, destroying the drone mid-air.
Another of these deceptions consisted of a very similar plan, but using an American fighter plane instead of a civilian plane. The pilot, while flying over the Gulf of Mexico, would radio his base to report that he had been attacked by a Cuban fighter aircraft and was going down. This was clearly false, since the American would be completely safe, heading to an airfield in his country. Meanwhile, an American submarine would throw parts of the fuselage of another plane into the ocean, along with an open parachute and other parts of the supposed vehicle. Days later, rescue teams would discover these remains and inform the media, which would soon spread the guilt of Fidel Castro. These were the main points of Operation Northwoods. Some consisted of typical disinformation and propaganda maneuvers, but much more extreme measures were also considered. Sinking boats full of refugees or attacking places frequented by Cubans were actions that were sure to lead to the death of some of them. These were American citizens, or people seeking to become American citizens. It was nothing more or less than state terrorism. But for the Department of Defense, these fatalities were justified if they succeeded in causing the invasion of the island and the overthrow of Fidel Castro. The question that may arise when hearing all this is, why did the United States government consider the Cuban regime such a great threat? The American power had maintained a great interest in the island since the beginning of the 20th century. The Caribbean government, although in theory it was completely independent, had always been influenced by orders coming down from the White House in Washington. The last of the American agents who had power in Cuba had been Fulgencio Batista, a brutal dictator who never sought to hide the close ties that united him with the United States. But the extreme cruelty with which he treated his population led to the outbreak of a revolution that removed him from power in 1959. The leader of this movement, who now held the presidency of Cuba, was none other than Fidel Castro.
Castro immediately set about both securing his position, implementing his socialist reforms in the country, and influencing other Latin American countries in their own political conflicts. The US didn't take too kindly to this whole socialism thing, both because of the Cold War and because it was primarily American companies that were being affected by the new socialist policies.
The new ruler was quick to fall out with the United States. He legalized the Communist Party again, which had been disbanded by Batista. He also nationalized private companies of American origin, taking them into the hands of the state. But none of these measures were as serious as the friendly relationship that Cuba showed with Uncle Sam's sworn enemies, the Soviet Union. Washington believed that the island could be used by Castro as a base from which to spread communist and socialist ideology to other Latin American countries. Therefore, to prevent this from happening, they decided to carry out a severe economic blockade, prohibiting any type of transaction and urging their political allies to do the same. This only led Castro to further strengthen his relations with the Kremlin, who replaced the United States as the main commercial partner. The growing threat that the Caribbean nations seemed to present led the Americans to quickly take action. As early as 1961, just 2 years after the revolution, President John F. Kennedy had approved a plan aimed at overthrowing the Cuban president. To do this, the CIA would provide weapons and vehicles to a group of refugees who would invade the country's coasts in a place called the Bay of Pigs. This offensive was carried out on April 17th, but failed after 2 days. leaving a balance of 6 American planes shot down and approximately 100 attackers dead.
9 U.S. servicemen actually flew combat missions in support of this invasion, 4 of which were shot down and killed in the process, something the U.S. government and the CIA would go on to deny for almost 30 years.
The U.S. attempt to overthrow Castro had been unsuccessful, but it was only the first of many. Members of the CIA and the Department of Defense began planning other ways to end the enemy regime. And so, in 1962, Operation Northwoods came about. However, when the outline of the plan was presented to the presidency, John F. Kennedy did not react as the military had expected. For the president, attacking American cities or their inhabitants was completely out of the question. In his view, the invasion of Cuba and the overthrow of Fidel Castro did not justify state terrorism. Operation Northwoods was scrapped. Kennedy was so repulsed by the proposal that he even removed its main creator, General Lyman Lemnitzer, from his position as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The refusal to authorize these ideas led to American military leaders beginning to view the then president with a bad eye, considering his stance towards Cuba too soft. However, while Operation Northwoods never went into action, attempts to depose Castro continued, including dozens of attempts on his life. But these were never successful, and the Cuban leader continued to rule the island until 2006. These plans were kept top secret until 1992. When they reached the public, the response was very negative both in Cuba and in the United States. Some people could not believe the lengths their military leaders were willing to go to. Those who were supposed to protect them had considered attacking and assassinating them to justify their political goals. For those who already distrusted their government, they came to see Operation Northwoods as evidence that the military had been involved in the Kennedy assassination. But for many, there was one question that kept repeating itself in their minds. If they had been able to prepare all these lies, what others had they planned? And of these, which ones had been carried out? We have reached the end of this video, and we want to ask you, do you think a false attack of this kind can be justified? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.